private shuttle descended through wisps of rose-gold clouds, offering Brock Hansen his first glimpse of Sunspire Academy, the most prestigious school in the galaxy. Yet, he couldn't help but wonder why it was in the singular. A sprawling spire of copper and bronze stretched toward the sky, its metallic surfaces catching the light of the system's ancient star, setting the entire cityscape ablaze in an ethereal brilliance. The sight might have taken his breath away, if he wasn't already determined to hate everything about it. "Your residence is located in the Western Quarter, young master," the pilot announced in carefully practiced English. "Shall I arrange for a guide to escort you to your first class?" "No, thanks." Brock ran a hand through his brown hair, deliberately messing up the careful styling his father's servants had insisted on. "I've got the NAV system." The shuttle touched down on one of the countless landing platforms dotting the university grounds. As the door slid open, Brock caught snippets of conversation in dozens of languages, all being simultaneously translated by the small device in his ear. Most of them seemed to be about him. Is that really the human student? Gabriel Hansen's son. He stepped out into the artificial sunlight, his boots clicking against the polished metal platform. The temperature was perfect, the gravity precisely Earth normal, and even the air had been meticulously filtered to remove any trace of the native atmosphere. My father's influence at work, no doubt. The thought made his jaw clench. The gathered students gave him a wide berth as he strode past. Some were Aryans, their metallic skin shimmering with intricate facial patterns that signified age and status. Others were blue-skinned Tripan, who moved with an almost artificial grace, or hulking gourds, their pale forms towering over their peers. And then, there were those Brock couldn't even begin to identify, despite the crash course in xenobiology he'd been forced to take before arriving. Pulling up the campus map on his personal device, he deliberately ignored the countless eyes tracking his every move. Sunspire Academy might cover an entire small planet, but finding his first class wasn't exactly rocket science. Though, given where he was, that might actually be on the syllabus this afternoon. An ironic first class. Human history. Of course, that would be his first class. He'd picked it partly because it was one of the few courses still accepting transfers this late in the term, but mostly because he figured he could coast through it. How hard could it be to learn about your own species? The classroom was housed in one of the smaller spires. Though small was relative when discussing architecture that dwarfed most Earth skyscrapers. Brock paused in the doorway, taking in the tiered rows of seats filled with an assortment of alien students. A gangly, wolf-like creature hunched over a data pad in the front row, while a particularly massive gourd occupied an entire bench in the back. One of the Aryan students stood, mouth opening to speak, but whatever they planned to say was cut off by the arrival of the professor. The entire class fell silent as Professor Youet entered. His skull-like face was almost entirely covered in swirling, ornate markings, signifying considerable age and status. His simple, practical clothing stood in stark contrast to the elaborate patterns on his skin. Brock slipped into an empty seat, already mapping out how he'd spend his enforced exile at this so-called prestigious institution. The professor began arranging his materials with methodical precision, and Brock couldn't help but notice how even that simple action drew the rapt attention of every student in the room. Well, almost every student. In the back, the gourd was openly staring at Brock, his pale eyes narrowed in what might have been curiosity or challenge. Brock met his gaze evenly, a corner of his mouth curving into a slight smirk. If the brute was looking to establish dominance, he'd picked the wrong human to intimidate. A historic introduction. "Welcome, class." Professor Youet's voice carried effortlessly through the room. "Today, we begin our exploration of humanity's brief but remarkable history. And it seems we are fortunate enough to have a primary source joining us." All eyes turned to Brock, though he noticed that the gourd in the back had already been watching him with an unsettling intensity. There was something predatory in those pale eyes, all four of them, that spoke of barely contained aggression. "Mr. Hansen," Professor Youet gestured to the front of the room. "Perhaps you would be willing to introduce yourself to the class?" Brock considered refusing, but he decided against it. No point in antagonizing the professor on day one. He stood up and made his way down to the presentation area, keenly aware of the mix of curiosity and apprehension in the students' expressions. "Name's Brock Hansen," he said, turning to face the class, hands casually tucked into his pockets. "From Earth." Obviously, probably the only student here who didn't actually apply to attend. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The wolf-like student in the front row, some species from the Portland Combine, Brock guessed, looked up from his data pad for the first time, brown eyes studying him with unexpected intensity behind thick-rimmed glasses. "You didn't apply?" Professor Youette's eyebrows lifted, the patterns on his face shifting, giving him an air of curiosity. "And yet, you were accepted into the most prestigious university in known space." Brock shrugged. "My father thought it'd be good for me. Something about the historic significance of being the first human student here." His tone was dismissive, and the murmurs in the room turned into shocked whispers. In the back, the gourd's nasal openings flared in what might have been a snort of derision. The movement drew Brock's attention to the crude, heavily armored clothing the alien wore, a style that skirted the edge of what was legally permitted on campus. "I'm sure there's a story there," Professor Youette said diplomatically, "but perhaps we should begin with our scheduled material. Please take your seat, Mr. Hansen." As Brock returned to his spot, he noticed how the other students shifted slightly away from him. Whether it was because of his species or his attitude, he couldn't tell. The wolf student was still watching him, head tilted slightly in what might have been curiosity. A few rows back, an Aryan student with intricate copper-tone facial markings leaned forward to whisper to their neighbor, "Can you believe the arrogance? Even for a Death Worlder." "At least the gourds admit what they are," came the whispered reply. "This one acts like he's at some pleasure resort." Brock pretended not to hear, but he filed away the term Death Worlder for future reference. "Famous for tools of death." The gore interrupted, his 4 eyes narrowing. "Yet you speak of them like toys?" The wolf student had fully turned in his seat now, his attention darting between Brock and the gore with analytical intensity. Other students shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to such confrontational exchanges in their classes. Professor Youette's expression was becoming progressively harder to read, his emotions making him gesticulate more vibrantly. "Perhaps, Mr. Hansen, you could explain how you came by such detailed knowledge. Are you from a military family?" "Not exactly." Brock considered his next words carefully. He was already developing a reputation, but there was no point in hiding it. They'd find out eventually. "I just enjoy sports shooting. It's a hobby." The resulting silence was deafening. Someone's data pad clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly still classroom. Even the gore seemed taken aback, his aggressive posture shifting to something more akin to confusion. Professor Youette's facial patterns practically danced as his mouth ran, and his head movements became erratic. "A hobby, you say? Would you be willing to elaborate on this recreational use of weapons?" The professor's enthusiasm was infectious, spreading through the classroom despite, or perhaps because of, the lingering shock. Even the gore's aggressive stance softened into genuine curiosity, his spine settling back. "A demonstration would be invaluable," Professor Youette said, eyes gleaming with academic excitement. "Though, I understand if you would prefer not to." "I got my gear back at my dorm," Brock interrupted, warming up to the idea despite his initial reluctance. Maybe this was the perfect opportunity to show them that humans weren't just violent Death Worlders. And a proper range setup. My father insisted on it. Probably the one thing we agreed on. The wolf student's ears perked up at this, his first obvious display of interest. "Your private residence has a dedicated firing range, among other things." Brock nodded. "The whole facility is pretty well equipped." Whispers rippled through the classroom at this casual mention of private accommodations. Most students, even those from wealthy families, lived in standard dormitory spires. Private residences were typically reserved for visiting dignitaries or senior faculty. Your father must be quite influential, one of the Ion students observed, their copper-toned patterns holding an almost envious shade of green. Though surely that was a coincidence. Brock shrugged. They like to throw money at things. Makes them feel important. Professor Youette quickly seized control of the situation before the discussion could derail further. If you're willing to demonstrate your hobby, I believe this would make an excellent practical lesson. The shuttle bay is just 2 levels down. The class moved with barely contained excitement. Data pads clutched close as they filed out. The Gore lingered near the back, his pale eyes fixed on Brock with an unreadable expression. The shuttle bay turned out to be more like a small starport, with vessels of various sizes arranged in neat rows. Their assigned transport was a sleek passenger model, its interior arranged in tiered seating reminiscent of the classroom. "How far is your residence, Mr. Hansen?" Professor Youette asked as the class boarded. "About 20 minutes by shuttle," Brock replied, settling into a seat near the front. "It's in the western quarter near the atmospheric processing complex." The Wolf student, who had somehow ended up in the seat beside him, looked up from his data pad. The premium residential district, he muttered more to himself than anyone else. Interesting. The shuttle lifted off smoothly, joining one of the designated flight lanes weaving between the massive spires. From this height, the true scale of the university became apparent. Buildings stretched to the horizon in every direction, their copper and bronze surfaces forming a metallic forest that sparkled in the sunlight. "Is it true that humans consider projectile weapons entertaining?" the Japan student Oviu asked, their blue skin almost luminescent in the filtered sunlight streaming through the shuttle's windows. "Some of us do," Brock answered carefully. "It's about skill and precision more than anything else. Like any sport." "Sport?" the Gore repeated, the word coming out like a challenge. His armor pressed against and slightly dented the seat as he leaned forward. "You play with weapons of war for amusement." "We turn a lot of things into sports," Brock said, keeping his tone casual. "Martial arts, archery, even throwing heavy objects for distance. Humans like to compete." The professor was enthralled, absorbing every word like a dedicated academic. "Fascinating. The recreational militarization of potentially lethal activities. This could explain much about human cultural development." The shuttle banked gently, descending toward a cluster of private residences set slightly apart from the main campus. Brock's temporary home was easily identifiable by its large landing pads and the subtle but effective security measures his father had insisted upon. "Fair warning," Brock said as they approached. "The targeting system is pretty basic compared to what you're probably used to. We keep things old school in sport shooting. Not that any of you will be using them unless you brought your own. I doubt any of you are licensed for human firearms." The private residence was a moderately sized dwelling by galactic standards, though it would have qualified as a mansion back on Earth. Brock led the group through a series of security checkpoints, each one scanning them with unobtrusive but thorough precision. "The range is through here," he said, gesturing toward a sealed doorway. "But first, we need to stop by the equipment room. Everyone needs proper ear protection." "Ear protection?" the Wolf student murmured curiously, tilting his head. Brock paid no mind. He figured the aliens just weren't used to bullets, especially if sports shooting was such a foreign concept to them. The equipment room was a testament to his father's thoroughness. Rows of protective gear lined the walls, each piece properly maintained and stored according to strict safety protocols. "These were custom-made," the professor observed, examining one of the devices. "Your father anticipated visitors. He likes to be prepared," Brock replied, helping one of the Orion students adjust their protection. "Though I doubt he expected the entire class to show up on day one." The Gore stood near the back, regarding the protective gear with skepticism. His pale skin seemed almost luminescent under room's lighting, and his spines had taken on a slight bristle that suggested uncertainty rather than aggression. "This seems excessive for simple sport," he rumbled, though he accepted the reinforced protection Brock offered him. Brock moved to a secure cabinet, pressing his hand against the scanner. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing his personal collection. He selected his favorite, a classic over-under shotgun that had been in his family for generations. The wood gleamed with careful maintenance, and the metal caught the light with mirror precision. "Fascinating," the professor muttered. "Is this a common model among human sports shooters?" "Common enough," Brock answered, checking the weapon with practiced ease. "It's tradition for clay shooting. Speaking of which," he pressed another control, and a section of the wall slid aside to reveal a rack of clay pigeons in a launching mechanism. The class watched with growing unease. Brock grinned. "Ready for your first look at human sport shooting?" Brock secured his ammunition supply and nodded. "Sure." "Oh." Fair warning. It only gets louder from here. Over the next hour, he demonstrated various shooting techniques, taking care to explain each step and safety measure. His movements remained deliberate, his weapon always pointed downrange. He noted how the students' flinches became less pronounced with each shot. "The spread pattern is determined by the choke," he explained, retrieving a fragment of clay to show the class. "See these marks? Each pellet leaves its own signature. In competition, judges can verify your hits by examining the break patterns." The wolf-eared student had drawn closer, his scientific curiosity evidently overcoming his earlier caution. "The mathematics of the dispersion must be fascinating," he mused, adjusting his glasses as he examined the fragment. "Have you studied the aerodynamics involved?" "Not really my thing," Brock admitted with an easy smile. "I just practice until I get it right. But I've got some technical manuals in the equipment room if you're interested." Several other students gathered around to examine the fragment, their initial fear replaced by academic interest. Even some of the Orion students, who typically prided themselves on maintaining dignified distances, joined the impromptu discussion. "Your control is impressive," one of them noted, golden skin gleaming as they traced the pellet marks. "Though I still question the wisdom of such activities." "Hey, that's fair," Brock replied, carefully storing his weapon. "Definitely not for everyone. But neither is zero-G dancing or deep space free diving, and plenty of species do those." A few chuckles rippled through the group, and several students nodded in agreement. The tension had nearly dissipated, replaced by the kind of casual academic discourse Brock had expected from the galaxy's most prestigious university. From his position near the back, Buer watched the exchange with growing intensity. His pale skin took on an almost metallic sheen as his spines bristled with barely contained emotion. "You make light of weapons," the guard growled, cutting through the conversation. "Play with them like toys and they welcome you for it. But when I speak of true combat, of honorable battle, they recoil." The other students shifted uncomfortably, several taking unconscious steps away from the massive alien. Brock noted how their expressions changed, from engaged curiosity to the wary distance he had seen before. "Different cultures, different perspectives," Brock offered diplomatically. "Humans just happen to have found a middle ground between." "You are soft," Buer interrupted, his armor plate scraping as he straightened to his full height. "You dress up petty violence in pretty words and safety protocols. At least my people acknowledge what we are." The wolf student's ears flattened against his head again, but his sharp eyes darted between the two Deathworlders. His datapad hung forgotten in his hands, all pretense of academic documentation abandoned in the face of growing tension. Brock simply smiled and began packing away his equipment. "Maybe," he agreed easily, "or maybe there's more than one way to be strong. Either way, I appreciate everyone coming out to learn about human culture, even the parts that might seem strange at first." The casual dismissal threw Buer off more than any challenge could have. Several students visibly relaxed, and the professor seized the opportunity to herd everyone toward the shuttle. As they filed out, Brock caught fragments of conversation that made him hide a smirk. "Did you see how careful he was with the safety protocols? I suppose if it's properly regulated. Really quite interesting from an academic perspective." Buer lingered behind the group, his four eyes fixed on Brock with an unreadable expression. For a moment, It seemed he might say something more, but instead he turned sharply and stalked toward the shuttle, his armor creaking with each aggressive step. The wolf student was the last to leave, pausing at the door. "Fascinating," he murmured, though whether he was referring to the shooting demonstration or the social dynamics, Brock couldn't tell. The next morning, Brock navigated the university's winding corridors with considerably less caution than the day before. The whispers still followed him, but their tone had shifted noticeably. "There goes a human who... Did you hear about the demonstration? They say he's actually quite..." He was so busy pretending not to notice that he almost missed a striking figure waiting by his classroom door. Almost. She was difficult to overlook. Someone who seemed to command the very light around her. The Japan woman's sapphire skin caught the morning sun streaming through the windows, creating an ethereal glow. Her blazing orange hair cascaded in artistic waves that suggested hours of careful styling. Her outfit, something more suited to a fashion runway than a classroom, fit her curves with obvious custom precision. "You must be Brock Hansen," she said, her voice carrying the practiced melody of someone used to being listened to. "I am Laryl Trinidad." She said the name as if it should mean something to him. Given the way every other student in the corridor had stopped to watch, maybe it did. "Nice to meet you," Brock replied simply, moving to step around her toward the classroom door. Her perfect smile flickered for just a moment. "I heard about your demonstration yesterday. How fascinating that humans have found a way to make art from warfare." She stepped closer, her movements deliberately graceful. "Perhaps you'd like to discuss it over dinner? I know a lovely place in the upper spires." "Thanks, but I already got plans," Brock said, not breaking stride as he entered the classroom. It wasn't even technically a lie. He did have plans. They just happened to involve ordering food to his dorm and calling his friends back on Earth. The silence that followed him into the room was absolute. Even the professor, already present and arranging his materials, seemed frozen in place. The wolf student's ears stood straight up, his glasses slightly askew as he stared openly instead of pretending to study. Laryl stood in the doorway, her composed expression cracking just slightly. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice losing some of its musical quality. "I am Laryl Trinidad." "Yeah, you mentioned that," Brock replied, settling into a seat and pulling out his datapad. "Like I said, nice to meet you." A Japan student near the back actually gasped. In the corridor beyond, dozens of faces peered in, their expressions ranging from shock to horror to barely concealed delight. Laryl opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. For possibly the first time in her life, she seemed at a loss for words. Finally, she turned on her heel and strode away, her perfect posture radiating indignation with every step. As conversation slowly resumed around him, Brock caught a whispered exchange between two Orion students. "He just rejected Laryl Trinidad. He really does have dangerous hobbies." I hope you enjoyed that story. Click here to watch another video featuring the same characters.